Hi, everybody. I want to thank you all for staying, and I just want to explain why we're all up here. This group is brand new on campus this year. We are the URI Standers. We are a bunch of athletes. We have people in Greek life. We have people in WOW, in Pink. We all came together and found a common goal where we want to raise awareness and provide education on issues about sexual assault, domestic violence, racism, and all of those types of things that they cover in community equity and diversity. So here's our vision statement.
You pretty much just said it.
Do you want to start with I stand?
I stand against racism.
I stand for active bystanders.
I stand for respect.
I stand for domestic violence.
I stand for equality.
I stand against violence.
I stand against biphobia.
I stand against sexual assault.
I stand for those who want to feel safe in any environment.
I stand against domestic violence.
I stand for social justice.
I stand for human rights equality. Lastly, we just want to thank Naomi Thompson. She's such a supporter of our group. So can we all give her a round of applause? And also, we want to thank our leader, Keith LaBelle, for everything he's done for us. He's a huge mentor to us, and we couldn't do this without him. Thank you very much.
So now we're going to the panel. And
So those of you who would like to continue the conversation, we would encourage you to come closer if you would. That would be greatly appreciated. And we have our resident experts who will continue the conversation. Do you want to just take a moment to kind of tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how your work intersects with what we just heard?
Okay, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Ray Ferguson. I'm in the history department. I teach African American history, Caribbean history, and my research area is on black women at the turn of the 20th century. When I think about the issues today, the political issues, what's happening in Ferguson, the things that Peniel talked about, violence has always been a factor in black life. There has always been there's always been an issue around black bodies in public space. You can take that back to slavery, to when people needed passes to be off the plantation, out in public, a reason that was approved of. In the work in the communities that I look at in the Midwest, at the turn of the 20th century, the period between 1900 and 1910 is one in which there's a lot of agitation, disruption, Peniel would call it. There's a lot of agitation around the use of public space and whether black citizens in cities like Indianapolis and Chicago should be able to use public parts. I'm thinking of a particular moment when I was doing research while I was in graduate school, and I was going through all these old black newspapers and looking at police reports because they would publish who was arrested from the community and for what. And I'm interested in club women who are predominantly respectable community leaders, and all of a sudden, I see their names come up in police reports as being arrested for prostitution. Well, as I investigate that further, it becomes apparent to me that these women are going into public parks in the city of Indianapolis on days that they're not allowed in public space to make a statement. And it coincides with movements in urban black communities throughout the Midwest in that time period that are pushing for access to public parks because school children need to go to botanical gardens. They need to be able to go to observatories. They need to be able to go to museums as part of their education. Because black school teachers, who in the summer are about the business of gaining the next credentialing for teaching, are attending Butler University in Indianapolis, for instance. And everyone else in their classes can go to the parks for museums, for the botanical gardens, except these black teachers. So it becomes a big issue. The NAACP's earliest court cases are about public space and the use of those spaces. So black bodies in public space is what I think of first when I hear about Trayvon Martin, about what's happened in Ferguson, about all the other instances of those kinds of actions.
Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Rob Waddell. I'm in the history department alongside Ray, and got a lot that I might potentially want to say. But as some of my students that are out here will tell you, I'm also pretty good at just looking at you until you speak. And so I think it's more important that we get some conversation from some of the folks out in the audience as well. So I'm going to try to be as brief as a historian can be in talking about what I do and where I fit in this conversation. Let me start by saying that the reason I am part of this conversation has just about everything to do with white privilege. I am a straight white male who is allowed and has been allowed to do and to say certain things without the same kinds of consequences that other folks might suffer. And I was allowed to progress through my childhood, through my high school years and my college years, getting into the kinds of things that sends other people to prison, that sends other people to lives that are very different than the one that I lead. And so the first thing I think that we have to recognize here is part of how I'm here and why I'm here and why some other folks maybe are not here at the moment. And we can talk more about that too. But just to give you a sense of where I come from in terms of my academic engagement and the scholarly things that I deal with, I am the author of a recent book that looks at Birmingham, Alabama. And part of what I was looking at in Birmingham was what happens in a place like Birmingham after the cameras go away, after Martin Luther King goes away, and after the rest of the country has stopped paying attention. So in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, you get the iconic images that we associate with much of the civil rights movement. You get police dogs, you get fire hoses, you get Bull Connor with his mini tank riding out and attacking school children 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, taking them off to prison, taking them off to the fairgrounds. And this is, as Peniel talked about earlier, this is part of what gets John F. Kennedy to say, maybe we need a Civil Rights Act. And it's part of what gives momentum going into the March on Washington in August of that year. But we get a reminder in September of that year that not everything has changed. And though there might have been an agreement to desegregate the downtown stores in Birmingham, you still have a city in which 4 girls and 2 young men on that same day can lose their lives because of white supremacy. And you still get a city in which the majority of those folks who are African American find themselves living in poverty. You get a majority of those folks who are African American living in neighborhoods with no streets, no sidewalks, no recreational facilities, no adequate sewer facilities. You find folks that cannot get jobs. You find folks that are still dealing with issues of police brutality. And you find folks that, despite the fact that you have a Civil Rights Act of 1964 or you have a Voting Rights Act of 1965, that those laws don't mean anything in their daily lives until they go out and force white folks to live by those laws. So I came in and said, well, what happens? And what happens in this interim, in particular between when you have Martin Luther King there and when you have the election of Birmingham's first black mayor in 1979. Did black folks go away? I didn't think so. Did they stop being active? Did they stop caring about these issues? No. And so I went in and I wanted to find out and I wanted to talk to the activists that were there for the long haul, the activists that were there on the everyday level, and the folks that were knocking on doors and were going and dealing with, well, why are you dealing today with the issues that you're dealing with? It's because your water's been cut off. It's because the housing authority won't grant you the money that you need. It's because you can't go in and get the welfare payments and the food stamps and the other things that you are entitled to, and so on. And so I chronicled a whole group of activists in Birmingham, steel workers who were fighting to make the Civil Rights Act of 1964 actually mean something. Hospital workers like Peniel's mother who were fighting to get a decent wage and to form a union amongst the custodians and the dietary workers and the janitorial and maintenance workers at the hospitals and medical centers around Birmingham. I looked at welfare rights activists and poor people's activists that were part of the Poor People's March that King was leading, but that were also doing these kinds of things in their own communities. And I looked at black radicals, and I looked at this group of Black Panthers, a group that modeled themselves after the Black Panthers, who looked around and said, you know, I've come back from the Vietnam War, I've participated in those 1963 protests, and yet I walk around here and I still get beat up by the police, and my community is still impoverished, and I still can't find a decent job. What this country doesn't need any more of is reform. What we need is revolution. And we need a complete overhaul of this system that we've been told is so wonderful for everybody, but seems to leave folks that look like me behind. And so I wrote about all those folks there and what they were doing. And I think that's partly instructive to what we talk about here, because those are not the folks that we think of when we think of the civil rights movement, when we think of a black freedom struggle, when we think of activism. What we often make the mistake of thinking is that we have to have a big march that's going to attract 1,000, 2,000, 100,000, 300,000 people. We have to have someone as charismatic as Dr. King to speak to us when we have that march and that rally, when the reality of activism and the reality of doing the hard work that makes society more equal and makes society a better place and includes everybody in all those democratic rights and freedoms that we profess to have is the kind of activism that includes knocking on doors and talking to people and going to downtown meetings and engaging in that kind of everyday community work that a group like SNCC was doing in Mississippi, or that other folks were doing in countless small towns and communities and in cities and neighborhoods across the country that we don't know a whole lot about. So I write about that stuff, and I encourage my students to think about how they can, instead of replicating the March on Washington, can replicate someone like Rita Anthony, or someone like Washington Booker, or someone like the folks that I interviewed at the ASIPCO steel plant, or the folks that I interviewed at the University Hospital in Birmingham, who made actual changes in their daily lives and in the daily lives of the people that lived around them, and then began to move out from there, because that's, for them, how change began to happen. That's all I really want to say. I'm working on a project now that looks at mass incarceration, that looks at the death penalty, that looks at the wrongful imprisonment of a African-American man who had the audacity to move his family into a previously all-white neighborhood and found himself on death row as a result. We can talk about that a little bit later if you want as well, but I do want to make this more of a conversation than anything else, if that's possible, with bright lights shining down on us and folks sitting in the dark back there.
So now it's time for you to ask questions. Kevin.
Kevin will tell you I'll stare at you.
Yeah, I'm going to bring this over to you.
Cool. Yeah, so for those who don't know, my name is Kevin. I'm a senior, graduating in May. Yes. On time. So with the previous conversation that was going on, the speaker, what was his name again?
Peniel Joseph.
Okay, so Keneal Joseph, is that? Peniel. Okay, thank you. So he was talking about how, the conversations on race, and ultimately I think he was hinting towards how does one become more culturally competent. So I know we've been having these conversations about race, class, and gender, and the intersectionalities to sort of connect those things together. But in sort of the bigger vision, how would you set a guideline, or what general advice would you have for someone, whether they identify with the majority or not, to acquire a cultural competence that allows them to have the tools necessary that they feel confident in engaging in these conversations without being uncomfortable? Because I know plenty of people of color who don't feel entitled or see their value in the contribution of, I'm a person of color and I think I can participate in this conversation. And the same goes for white people. So I just want to see how we can sort of bridge the gap and sort of permeate cultural competence across the board in terms of how do we do that in a big vision sort of sense, as opposed to just saying, oh, race, diversity, and multiculturalism, because there's a whole lot of things that fit within the spectrum. I know the question's a little long, but.
I think Dr. Joseph, at the end of his talk, gave you some very sound advice. Read as much as you can, learn as much as you can about what happened. I'm thinking of a talk that John Hope Franklin gave in 1992. And John Hope Franklin is a black historian who's published over 100 volumes of information about African American history, and who was instrumental in digging out the sources for that history, the primary sources, traveling through the South during Jim Crow segregation, going to archives at a time that archivists and librarians didn't know what to do with him when he showed up, because they didn't think black people had intellectual capacity to look at their own history. The more you learn, the more confident you will be, and the better you will be able to deal with a larger context. In his talk in 1992 at the University of Missouri, Franklin was invited to speak about Du Bois's message in 1903 when he wrote in Souls of Black Folk, the problem of the 20th century is the color line. And Franklin starts his talk with Du Bois's quote, and then his next sentence is, the problem of the 21st century is the color line, because we haven't figured it out in the 20th century. And he was only a decade away from the 20th century ending. His advice was for people of good conscience, okay, just ordinary people. My students always ask me, who's the next Martin Luther King? I don't know, might be you. Okay, but you need to think, learn as much as you can so that you feel grounded in you with dealing with these issues. People respond to confidence, whether you fit in or not. And more importantly, if you don't fit in, you feel good in yourself about what you're doing. You learn from that and you move on to the next thing. And one more thing I want to add. And those of you who are my students are probably sick of hearing this. But when I was in 11th grade in high school, we used to take civics classes, something that they don't have anymore in most schools, in which you learned about the government setup, but also your responsibilities as a citizen. And when Peniel was talking, I was remembering being told, as a citizen in a democracy, you have a responsibility to critique things that you see are wrong, to stand up for people who are the underdogs. Otherwise, democracy doesn't work. So prepare yourself for that. And it's not like you prepare yourself for a month and then you're ready and you do it. You learn on your feet. If you talk to any of the civil rights activists, they'll tell you it's the doing of the work that taught me how to do it, taught me myself and how to do it. Dr.
Waddell? Well, I'll say one thing really quickly, and that is that we have to be okay with being uncomfortable. And we have to be okay with not feeling exactly in our comfort zone. And we have to be willing to work within that and be all right with that and acknowledge that, to have those kinds of conversations. And we need to be willing to listen to what other people have to say, even if it critiques us, and even if it has implications for us. But what I also want to say is Kevin, since this is a conversation, how did we do that in our class? How did we get to a point where we could talk about race and we could talk about class and we could talk about those issues of privilege in ways that we hadn't, that many of the students had not talked about before? You tell me.
Yeah, I mean, okay, yeah. Initially, it was very clear that when the first ever topic of race in general was touched upon, that everybody was uncomfortable except me, because I'm the brown kid in the classroom who has no problem talking about race and making other people uncomfortable in the atmosphere. And I don't want nobody to think that I condemn the majority. That's not what I'm about. I try to provide a platform for people to actually think about the things that they say and why they say them. But I think really when the class started to get more comfortable around it is not only with the readings, but when we started all hanging out together and then we went to Alabama. I think when we went to Alabama, we all sat at the dinner table for the spring break trip. It was when we really got to get down to the nitty gritty of what people actually thought about issues of race, and then being able to dismantle that and say, you know, that mentality might be a little problematic, but you're not too far off, and I don't want you to think that you have no value in it. But it was being around those people again and again, and them realizing that after a certain point, like, you're gonna have to express your opinion and not tread so lightly, because the conversation of race is seldom ever gonna get talked about in a serious context. If you go about it very easygoing and you're kind of just treading the waters very light, you have to really dive in and say, you know, what's the status quo? How are we talking about this, and how can we make feasible change that'll ultimately alter our mentality in terms of talking about it?
It will probably never be comfortable.
Oh yeah, definitely not.
That's a given.
And I see some hands in the back, but I would, as I'm walking the mic over to Jaleesa, I would just want to add that not only should we get comfortable with the uncomfortable dialogue, but embrace that it's part of the learning process, so that when you are uncomfortable, look at it as, this is my education that I am paying for, and I'm getting that experience, not just being in this uncomfortable space. Jaleesa, you had, and then I see you in the back.
Hello. So earlier, Dr. Joseph had spoken about the fact that there are unjust policies and there is a lack of availability of time to discuss all the things that are encompassed in social justice issues. But I'm a little bit unsatisfied with the lack of coverage for personal responsibility on the part of the adults of this nation. Because I think I was a teacher in Oakland for 3 years at the worst schools in this nation, where gunfire happened on a daily basis and was never covered in the news. I've had to corral students into classrooms to prevent them from dying from gang violence feet away from this doorstep of their school, and watched other people run away. And I'm 4 feet something, I don't know, and I don't know how to protect anybody from a bullet, but I know that it was my personal responsibility to take care of a student and their need, regardless of whatever their backstory was, or et cetera, et cetera. And so when I moved here, I felt like that's the experience that I'm coming with. I was a teacher. I took those kids to go to Google headquarters to show them there is something different than whatever you're experiencing here. I need to show you exactly where the other things are, because you don't know that there's anything outside of this realm. So I took them to those different places. And that's what my earlier comment was about, is like, how do you, as a professional, take responsibility and say, I'm just going to take you out of this situation because I know all that information And I know that you don't have the time to read an anthology about how to educate yourself on the history of social injustice in this country. So I'm going to take personal responsibility. So my question to you all is, how do so-called multicultural educators who spend time educating themselves get out of their book and go and do something instead of waiting for students to come to them, because they don't know what they don't know? So what kind of comments do you guys have about educators who will actually sit here and listen to some dialogue like this and then actually go and educate students and take them to the places where they need to go to reach success?
Great question. How do you engage?
Great question. How do you engage?
Engage your students and get them involved.
Well, I hear more than that in your question. I hear frustration with people who don't do that. And I'm hearing that you want to know a way to make them do that. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure, beyond talking to them about it and listening to them about it, that you can make them do that. I think we all make personal choices about how we're going to interact with other human beings in our lives. And if we're on the one as we go through life, that choice will become refined or change or whatever. You know, I was thinking when you were talking, when you were sitting back there, about your father taking you and telling you the stories of what was going on. When I was coming up, and I'm someone who grew up during Jim Crow segregation, probably because life was so hard, because all we had was each other, people who might not have normally spoken to each other become involved with each other, because we all lived in the same areas, struggled with the same day-to-day, whether you were a doctor or a street sweeper. It seems to me that adults were always taking a child aside and asking them, so what do you think about this? You know? And I'm not so sure that all of that is gone, because many of my students, particularly my students of color, I can smell the raisin on them, you know, that some adults in their life took the time to do that or to ask the questions. Now, some of us when we're young, and I'm one of them, was hard-headed and a knucklehead and didn't always respond to those moments or take them in a way that might have made that person do that for someone else, you know. But I think I'm a great believer in personal power, you know. Policy and legislation, it may or may not do everything I want it to do. But I think if each of us makes a choice, and this is where I was trying to get to before, but I kept going off, about how the 5 feet around you in the world looks, what you want in that space, the whole world's a different place, you know, and whatever you do does have some influence on the people around you. I've reached a point where I don't need to know or see that it has, because I get enough feedback every now and again that I know if one person tells me something 50 years later, then there's a whole bunch of other people who are just too busy to say it. So I think what you're asking is really something very personal. I'm also thinking, I took the time last week to watch Michelle Alexander's talk at Union Theological Seminary in New York last week. She was the Woman of Spirit speaker. They invite someone every year. And I was really surprised because she started off giving the talk that she does with all the data about mass incarceration, the stuff from her book, you know, talking about the problem. And she stopped and said, you know, I'm tired of talking about the problem, so today I'm going to go somewhere else. And where she went was, she prefaced it by saying, the change that you want is not going to come from policy, from legislation. It's only going to come from individuals who, one by one, until you have a mass, do the right thing, do what they think is right in life. So I'm not saying give up on trying to make Congress get off its butt and do something right or any of that stuff. But you have to make personal choices about how you're going to live your life and what you want to see this space around you look like. And sometimes you're out there by yourself, and sometimes your little bubble bumps up against somebody else's and gets a little bigger, But that's just part of, I think, growing and living. Does that help at all? Somewhat. I know it's not a pat answer.
I'm going to interrupt because we're a little bit over our time. It's 9:08. So, but Dr. Lisberger had one last question. So we're going to ask that, and then we're going to wrap up and say thank you for everyone who stayed for this additional conversation.
Hi.
Hey.
So you know me, I like to bring it home. So I think it's really nice to take these ideas to Birmingham or wherever, but we know that we have a lot of race issues and conversations that aren't happening on this campus. So I really have a very specific question that is something I've only heard about from some faculty, and I don't think, Ray, this probably applies to you, but I do think that especially young women of color faculty find themselves mistreated in the classroom. That is, their opinions are doubted, their grading is doubted, their policies are doubted. And I find this is a very serious issue here, and it probably has something to do with why URI has such a poor record of retaining faculty of color. So I'm just wanted to ask about this one issue. What would you do at this university to change the fact that people of color who are also teaching have a rough time sometimes?
Your turn.
Thank you.
There's a lot I would do at this university about that specific concern, which I think is a very real concern. And again, I go back to some of what I had to say earlier. These are the kinds of things that, because of the position I occupy, that I don't often have to worry about, and I don't have to think about. And so, I think, and maybe this is a bit of a cop out, but the first step in that process is acknowledging the problem and saying that it is a problem. And I think beyond that, it is making URI and other university spaces into places where there are enough female faculty, there are enough faculty of color, there are enough faculty from LGBTQ backgrounds, and so on, that that becomes the norm, that becomes sort of just the acceptable in some ways. But that's sort of a long-term grand vision. I think peer support is crucial. I think knowing that someone has your back is crucial. And I think articulating that somebody has your back is crucial in those kinds of situations. I often talk to my students, and I have a wonderful student who started a peer support network for students of color in the sciences. And that's the kind of thing that also needs to exist for faculty. That's the kind of thing that also needs to exist for folks that are not just students anymore. But I think we also, and part of what I was thinking about in the previous question, was sometimes we need to take our peers aside, or we need to take other folks aside and just tell them, you're smart, you're accomplished, you're worthwhile, and we don't often do that. And I find, I find, at least in dealing with my students, that some of them are shocked, when I actually tell them, you know what, you're smart. You know what, you have good ideas, and you can do this work. And I don't think they hear that enough, and I think maybe our faculty don't hear that enough either. And I think maybe we're put into situations where we're told that we have to strive and strive and strive and serve and serve and serve the the university in these various ways, but lost in some of that is the building of community amongst our own selves here, where you can have those kinds of interactions and you can have that kind of support. So I'm afraid that's a bit of a cop-out maybe, but that's where I'm at right now.
We not only need faculty or peers that we can talk to, Jody. I have dealt with that in my teaching career here and in Illinois, and at different times felt physically threatened, okay, by students. And my colleagues in the department may understand what I'm talking about, but the administration, not so much. People who otherwise may be very caring and kind just don't get it when I talk about, being threatened in my class, or being my authority being threatened in class because I'm a black woman and this white male student doesn't want to hear me talk about U.S. history, and storms down to the office to ask, is she really teaching the class? And comes back and tells me, I thought an older white man was teaching the class, and that sets a tone for the class from day one. I mean, I could give you umpteen stories. And in all those experiences, the most difficulty I had and the most harrowing weeks that I spent after were because administrators, when I followed the pipeline and the protocols that each university had in place, said, are you sure? I think you're imagining. He's never done anything like this before. Yeah, I'm sure. So not just more diverse faculty, we need to do something about the people who are actually running the business of the institution. And I'm not so sure, because the police are trained, right, to deal with diversity. And you see what happens with the police. We need to hire people, who are from diverse backgrounds or who did get it. Does that answer you?
Yeah, I would just respond.
Yeah.
I think that it's too bad that more faculty who are not of color, although I think white people have a race too, and they need to realize that. I wish that there was a more active effort on the part of privileged faculty to speak to their students and to really take a stand. I don't think one can put the pressure of this on students. I think it's on faculty.
Yeah.
And I don't think we do a good job of that.
Yeah. But also students, when I've approached students to talk about that, a lot of them just want to get out of his class, get their degree, and go on with their life, and are worried about backlash, which is legitimate,
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for staying on so late, and I'd actually like to acknowledge to Jody that it's happened to me too in the classroom, and you just speaking up and talking about it, I think makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you all.
So I also, in response to that, I think that we need to have more dialogue like this, and there needs to be a greater level of accountability, because I'm from the senior administration. I have worked in other institutions, and I have been in the classroom, but not in the same way. And so my instinct would have been, if somebody is disrespecting me, I'm going to take control of that class. I'm going to ask that person to either respect me or to leave. Now, if you do not have the support of your chair and your dean and the provost or up the food chain, that could be a problem that comes back where if that student complains about you. So I think we need to talk about these issues in a very transparent way, talk about solutions that work for those who are on the front line, and then call upon the administration to be supportive of you in those instances. Because if we're not doing what we should be doing at the administrative level, then we need to know and make a change. And right now is when we begin that process. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.